It is an organ, certainly more delicate and complicated than a kidney or muscle, and more important to us because in a way it is us, but still an organ. It remains a profound mystery, a single working entity, a concert of electricity and chemistry, a structure that strives to know itself.
Swedenborg, born in Stockholm in 1688, grew up in this world. An honors student at Uppsala University, he was skilled in 9 languages. As heir to his father's title, Baron Swedenborg was an active member of the Swedish House of Lords. A versatile inventor, his designs include a glider aircraft, the first known vehicle to incorporate aerodynamic principles necessary for flight. Appointed Royal Assessor of Mines in 1719, Swedenborg helped establish the sciences of metallurgy and crystallography. Swedenborg mastered all the sciences. He published over 70 treatises in Latin on subjects from astronomy to zoology. He anticipated many later findings, such as the molecular basis of magnetism and the nebular origin of planetary systems. But Swedenborg never considered science an end in itself.
I was introduced to the natural sciences, and I studied them for 30 years. Thus I was prepared to understand the things which lie deeply concealed in man, and serve as an instrument for laying them bare.
Swedenborg began this quest with an exhaustive study of human anatomy and physiology. His many findings include the discovery of the function of the endocrine glands. But by the 1740s, he focused all of his research on a single subject, the human brain. He was first to discover the synchronous action of the brain and lungs, the functions of the cerebellum and pituitary, the thinking and memory areas of the cerebral cortex, and the integrative action of the nervous system.
The human brain is the result of an unbroken chain of evolution from the earliest forms of life.
By all your many sciences and studies, You have been of great service to the learned doctors and physicians. So why should you concern yourself with spirits and such things? These are matters best left to the church.
The single purpose of my studying anatomy was to search for the seat of the soul in the body. For the soul is represented in the body, which is its mirror.
He would not find the soul by dissecting the brain. The purely intellectual approach, the methodology of the age of reason, would not suffice. Swedenborg had to go beyond the intellect to experience the soul directly.
Sometimes, Your Reverence, he just sits there like that for hours with his eyes closed. He aren't asleep, though. And sometimes he'll just smile or frown, or nod his head like he was hearing voices or something.
Swedenborg continued his search for the soul by exploring the mysteries of his own mind. For years, he analyzed his dreams and visions, compiling one of the most complete records of inner experiences ever assembled. Swedenborg also developed a meditation technique for probing his own subconscious. Although he was probably unfamiliar with Eastern meditation, his techniques were similar to those of yogis and other Asian mystics. The monks and saints of Asia, they all turned within, striving to go beyond the individual personality to the universal core, the soul. And Swedenborg, like the great visionary saints, was to experience a transformation. It occurred one April evening in 1745. Twice, a vision of Jesus appeared to Swedenborg and instructed him to change the course of his life.
Make me worthy of thy grace.
And you believe he was actually before you, in your very room?
Yes. And from that day forth, I gave up the study of worldly sciences, and I labored in spiritual things. The Lord opened my eyes so that I could see in the middle of the day the other world, and in a state of perfect wakefulness, converse with angels and spirits.
Swedenborg treated these angels and spirits as reflections of his own subconscious. For example, he believed that an angel in a vision or dream corresponds to that which is angelic within ourselves. A demon corresponds to that which is demonic. And he developed a system to interpret this kind of imagery, which he called correspondences. The Bible. Swedenborg discovered in many passages symbolic imagery similar to that of his dreams and visions. And he recognized that these symbols were correspondences, divinely inspired guides to human psychology and the soul. For example, the opening passages of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth can be translated, in the beginning, we are each created with spiritual realities, symbolized by heaven, and material needs, symbolized by earth. As we evolve, we learn to strike a balance within ourselves, integrating heavenly and earthly concerns. This evolution culminates symbolically on the sixth day with the creation of Adam, who represents wisdom, and Eve, who represents love. The union of wisdom and love leads to the psychological wholeness, the inner peace, represented by the seventh day, the day of rest. Each of the other images in the story of creation, creeping things, fish, beasts, represents a stage in the evolution of human consciousness. Genesis, when viewed in the light of correspondences, becomes an ageless model of man created in the image and likeness of God. For man is the microcosm, the universe in miniature.
All things which exist in the created universe have such a correspondence with all things of man that it may be said that man is a kind of universe.
This is the problem that both Darwin and many other people tried to face and tried to solve in various kinds of ways, all of them being quite unsatisfactory. I think they were unsatisfactory because they didn't stop to analyze exactly what consciousness was. And when we do analyze what consciousness is, we then see that it is based on language, is based on metaphor.
Visual metaphors and patterns of sound that the brain translates into meaning. Language is the brain's ultimate achievement. Language is the route by which thoughts are made conscious, and it exists within us only as a network of nerve impulses.
5, 6, 7, 8.
The human brain is unique in its abilities to explore, to create, to adapt, and to think about itself. One might imagine that it is completely unlike anything else on Earth. And yet, in structure, it is not so unique. In fact, it bears a long evolutionary heritage. Neurons are seen even in very primitive, brainless animals, like the jellyfish. The brains of many vertebrate animals have a basic structure similar to that of our own. By looking at their brains, we learn about ours. Typically, a brain consists of 3 major parts. Here's the brain of a fish. It has a part called a brain stem, it has a cerebellum, and it has a cerebrum. This is a very primitive brain. The crocodile is a more complex animal. Its brain is larger in proportion to its body. But it too has a brain stem, a cerebellum, and a cerebrum. A goose is more complex still. Brainstem, cerebellum, cerebrum. The intelligence of an animal species depends largely on the size of its cerebrum in relation to its body. As we climb the evolutionary ladder, we can see an increase in the relative size of the cerebrum. A human brain, while it shares the same basic three-part structure, has a cerebrum that is proportionally larger and more highly developed than that of any other animal. However, among humans, almost no correlation exists between brain size and intelligence. More than any other part of the brain, our cerebrum makes us human, yet we couldn't function without the other parts. The brain is a very delicate organ. For protection, it floats in fluid. It is wrapped in 3 layers of supporting membranes, and finally, it is encased in bone, the skull.
What we have here are a series of endocasts that go from roughly a modern-day chimpanzee to modern-day Homo sapiens, with sort of the fossil grades in between them. These are Australopithecines from South Africa, and they date probably to about 2.5, possibly to 3 million years. This happens to be a robust Australopithecine, which goes back to about 2 million years, 1.5 million. These are possibly Homo erectuses from Kenya, East Africa, which have a date around 2 million to 1.5 million years. This is a Homo erectus from Java, which is about 800,000. This happens to be the La Chapelle Ausant Neanderthal from France, probably dated at about 40 to 45,000 years ago. And like I said, this is modern Homo sapiens. If you look at them, you can see clearly that there is a large difference in size between something like that and modern Homo. The question is, are there also shape differences in these? You can say that this surface is very flat in this region here, which we think has to do with the receptive speech area, and yet it's very, very rounded and protuberant in the modern Homo case. You can say that qualitatively, but to demonstrate it quantitatively and prove it is the object of this exercise.
The brain endocast to be examined is clamped in position, and a series of measurements taken over the whole surface. These are recorded so that a 3-dimensional plot is obtained, which can be dealt with mathematically. And the result shows clearly that there is not only the obvious growth in size as the brain evolves, but that an exaggerated bulge had already begun to show itself in the speech processing area in man's earliest ancestors.
And it leads one to speculate that perhaps they did have some kind of rudimentary, primitive sort of speech. Fully elaborated in our own sense, undoubtedly not. But a beginning, yes.
Most of us use our right hands for throwing, or jump higher using our right foot for takeoff. We are all more skillful with the limbs on one side of the body rather than on the other. This lack of symmetry in the body reflects a lack of symmetry in the structure of the brain. Each half or hemisphere of the brain controls the limbs on the opposite side of the body, but each half also tends to specialize in different ways of thinking and perceiving. The human brain is the result of an unbroken chain of evolution from the earliest forms of life. The nerve impulses by which primitive organisms react are identical to those in the human brain. The only difference is that the nerve cells have increased in number and in complexity of organization to become eventually man's specializing hemispheres. Only 1/10 of the human cortex is used in controlling movement. 9/10 is focused inward, toward the world of thoughts and emotions. A world that spreads far beyond the instinctive behavior of the animal kingdom.
We have absolutely no evidence of language in the past. The archaeological past is silent, absolutely silent. All we have are the products that man makes, and from those we try to infer possible use of language. And we have the evolution of the brain and the brain structures, and from those we try to infer a use of language. So you have this question. You have tools which suggest an increasing complexity, and you have the evolving brain which suggests an increasing complexity of function. Now the question is, what was going on in that brain and with those tools? And that is the prime question. What was going on inside?
Through some of the Stone Age cultures that still exist, we can look back toward our evolutionary past and speculate further about the origins of language.
The hominid tools are either of bone or of stone, and if they're of stone, then you have to know where the stone comes from. You have to go and get the stone. You have to know the qualities of the stone and the source of the stone. You then have to bring it back and make it for a particular purpose. And every human tool is the solution to a problem. In other words, you don't make a tool until you have a problem. What language is talking about is a more complex visual world. Everything that happens in your terrain is in the visual world. Everything that happens, you then mark by language. So therefore, as your world becomes more complex, as your visual world becomes more complex, you need some kind of marking and linguistic system to indicate what part of the world you're talking about at what time. It's just a development of the increasing complexity of the visual world, which at the same time is increasing complexity in language and increasing complexity in the use of artificial symbols, of colors, of all kinds of other visual markers. But the visual markers are part of the linguistic development. It's all part of one package. Language simply marks something far more complex that you already know. It's sort of cues along the road to understanding. And therefore, nothing that is ever said contains all the information. So that what you really have evolving is not language, but the human capacity, which is a complex. And it's that complex that the brain sits on. Not just language, not just tool use, but all of these things go together. Language is part of tool use. You use the tool in a problem. you use language in a problem, so that really what you have is a complex which was evolving concurrently and simultaneously in every area of the brain. And that is the hominid evolution.
I want to start off talking to you about some misconceptions that every educated person, or nearly every educated person, has about language. I want to show you how terribly important language is, and I want to show you that language is just not a series of words strung together. And this business about the misconception about language and words, probably the most important one is this conviction that so many of us have, that words have meaning, that every word has or should have one unalterable and unchanging meaning. Well, this is just not so. As we're going to see, words never have just one meaning ever. Again, the words in a language, even in the same society, people of the same kind of educational background and so on, different words have different areas of meaning coverage for them. For instance, take color words. Now men in our culture get along pretty well with a half a dozen color words like red, blue, green, yellow, and so on. Of course, men that have to concern themselves with color professionally, like color chemists and artists, have more words, more color words. And women always have more color words than the ordinary man in our culture. I can remember some years ago my wife had a very pretty dress, and I always called it to myself her green dress. So one night she said to me, "Honey, what dress shall I wear tonight?" And I said, "Wear your green dress." And she looked at me kind of amazed, and she said, "You know I don't have a stitch of green to my name. I look simply livid in green. Which one do you mean?" I said, "I mean the one that buttons up the back." She said, "Oh, you mean my aqua dress. I've told you 100 times that's aqua." Well, my wife can not only tell the difference between aqua and green, she can tell the difference between aqua and turquoise, and this is something, believe me, I can never do. So in other words, she has different color words to talk about, different color impressions that she happens to have. These particular words cover different referent areas for her and for me, men and women in the same culture. Now, I would say that probably she sees the world of color differently than I do, and she has, partly by virtue of the fact that she has these different color words. Now, it's not only within one language and in one culture that we find such a thing as color words being different and making perhaps people see the world differently through different color words. Let's examine for a minute the whole matter of the spectrum. Now, in our particular language, in our particular culture, we break up what we call the spectrum with 6 color terms: purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Now, these 6 color terms do the job very well for us, and as far as we're concerned, that's the way the spectrum is. This is the normal and natural way. But do all languages use 6 color terms for these same impressions of the physical world coming in to physiologically normal people? No. For instance, a language in western Nigeria called Shona has only 3 color terms. This term, chipsuka, here you see, and here covers purple and orange and red, that whole area. Whereas Chitema and Chikena split the blue-green-yellow business between them. And there's another language in western Nigeria, Bassa. And Bassa has only 2 color terms, Hui and Zizan. And you might say, well, this seems incredible. These people must be colorblind. How can they get along with only 2 color terms? Can't they tell the difference between the color of the grass and the color of the sky? Well, if you ask them, they'd say, sure. That's sky hui, and that's grass hui. In other words, they get along perfectly well. They get the same kinds of impressions generally, physically, that we do, but having different words. I'm quite sure they see the world of experience differently than we do because it is filtering to them through different words. Words now where there are only 2 words, where we have 6. At least I'm sure it's this way in terms of this turquoise, green, blue business between me and my wife. I know she sees the world of color differently from the way I do. So you can see then that words never have one meaning, and that words themselves, in the same society, in the same language, and in different languages, split the world of experience in terms of different color reference. Now, so far, what we've been talking about, really, has been words sort of pulled out of isolation, certain kinds of words, and we've been examining this business of the shaky business of words and their meaning. But we will find also that words can play other kinds of tricks on us. When we get words, for instance, that are paired off against one another, whole classes of words that seem to split the world of reality down the middle. Our languages, our familiar European languages, of which English, of course, is a member, go in for this kind of splitting a great deal. For instance, we have a whole series of words like good and bad and right and wrong, which seem to split the world. These are polar opposites. It seems impossible for us to actually have a word that could go between, that could split the difference between these. And because words like good and bad and right and wrong are, so to speak, at the top of this splitting list, it makes a whole series of moral judgments. A whole lot of words get pulled in to this particular classification, and we react to them in terms of what I would call a moral judgment. At least this is a theory and one that we're working on. Now notice, good, bad, right, wrong, moral, immoral. Can you possibly think of a word between moral and immoral, one that would split the difference? Well, if you thought of amoral, immediately you'd find that it would be attracted over here. An amoral person is at least childish. He hasn't yet grown up or become mature enough to know the real difference between right and wrong. And if you notice that in our courts of law, we either plead guilty or not guilty. In other words, a person, unless he can be proved by due process of law to be guilty, has to be regarded as though he were innocent. In many cultures, it isn't a question of are you guilty or not guilty. It's a question of how guilty are you. In other words, other languages are not using these particular kinds of dichotomies and aren't seeing the world through this kind of splitting down the middle. For instance, let's take a few others to see if our theory bears out at all. Take a word like work. Now, obviously, a word like work is a very, very good word indeed. This is something highly prized in our culture. What's the opposite of work? Play, you'd say. Well, play is for children. But take a word like leisure. Leisure has no opposite but work. And it comes right over there. And don't you think perhaps that maybe we don't prize leisure quite as highly as we think? Satan always finds some work for idle hands to do, right? All right, now we can take a couple of other examples. For instance, there's one word that's interested me for years, and that word is the word theoretical. I've often wondered what Americans think the opposite of theoretical is. So we went out again with our film crew, and we asked some people what the opposite of theoretical was. And this is what we got.
I would say that theoretical was the opposite of practical. A practical reason for a thing is something that we can use in our everyday life. Theoretical, perhaps, is a thing that we know to be true, but is not the thing we can use every day.
Theoretical, well, that's the opposite of practical to me. And I like to do things with my hands, and I'd much rather do things than to think about them. So that a practical approach rather than a theoretical approach is much more appealing to me. I understand it better than the theoretical approach.
So the opposite of theoretical is practical. And practical is obviously on this side. And again, a word like research. I asked an American just the other day, what's the opposite of research? Research's opposite is production, without a question. In other words, I wonder then how we think about those people who are concerned in research, theoretical matters. I think we're probably of two minds about them, which might explain a lot of newspaper headlines we have today. Now, do all languages work like this? No. Chinese, for instance, doesn't. Chinese has a word, hao, which we translate good. But if you should ask a Chinese gentleman, if you met him on the street, Xiancheng hao, if you said that to him, it would mean honored one, firstborn person, are things good with you? His answer would be hao. But does hao really mean good, right, moral, innocent? No, it means for the shape I'm in, I should complain. And if he should answer you bu hao, which we would translate bad, would it mean things are bad? No, it means for the shape I'm in, I shouldn't complain. But since you asked me just this once, I'll tell you, though I know things have been like this for 2,000 years in the past and will be like this for 2,000 years in the future. In other words, what it means is that we really can't translate the Chinese word into English, nor can English words be translated in this regard into Chinese. And that may be one of the reasons why we're having difficulty with the Chinese right now in international relations. So what I've been doing for the first half of this program is to be talking to you about words. And I've tried to show you that words can get us into trouble, that words themselves are not language, and that words themselves don't do the whole job. If language is more than words, what makes words operate? Well, words operate in language because language is pattern. And the thing that makes words work are patterns. That is what does the job. And this whole magnificent, amazing business of patterning, from the smallest sounds into words and up through the whole thing, that's what we're going to be talking about on this series of programs. Now, to show you how words can operate through patterns, let me show you something here. Let's take a word and pull it right out of pattern, right out of language. Toes. Now, you will say, obviously, that word doesn't mean anything. Well, let me show you how, if we put it back into pattern, we can get it to do some work for us. We can see that it can get meaning. Now, here it is. Now, notice. This is, of course, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which I've loved for years, and I've always said it this way, and I'm going to read it for you now. I don't know how you perhaps said it, but I've said, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogroves and the mulmurads outgrave." Right away now, I know, having this in pattern, that toves are more than one here, that slithy toves are obviously toves that are slippery and slimy, and that toves can gyre and gimble and wear better but in the wave, a very natural place for them to gyre and gimble. And brillig obviously refers to a time of day or condition of the atmosphere where it's particularly appropriate for slithy toves to do their gyre and gimbling in the wave. I have actually given it, then, meaning. I have given this word toves meaning and several other words because it has been put into patterns, grammatical patterns as we call them, and distributional patterns. This whole business of patterning, only man has been able to actually invent language. Language is man's alone, his first and greatest human invention. No other form of animal life can talk. And this business of patterning only is man's possession. And again, patterning in language is what we're going to be talking about on this series of programs. Now, these kinds of patterns, these distributional patterns and grammatical patterns, let me say something for just a moment about grammatical patterns, for instance. Now, here is the grammatical pattern, the favored sentence type of a language like English, the actor, action, result sentence type, the subject, verb, and complement we all learned about in school. This kind of pattern, along with the fact that the verb must be put along a timeline, past, non-past, or present and future. This pattern allows words to work for us, allows us to talk about the world of experience. For instance, we can say, I went to Paris. Mr. Jones went to Paris. But we also have to say, the road went to Paris, when we know perfectly well that roads don't get up and go anywhere and nobody takes them anywhere. So obviously, then, these kinds of grammatical patterns, which are obligatory, are straitjackets on us, allow us to talk, allow the words to work for us. But at times, because the pattern is obligatory, sometimes we put words into the slot and begin to react to them as though they were alive. So these particular kinds of grammatical patterns allow words to work for us. What I'm going to do now is, and what I've been doing, is just giving you a very brief survey of patterns. I'd like to show you now, if I could, another pattern, what we call the intonation pattern. In other words, we've talked very briefly about grammatical patterns, about distributional patterns. Now the intonation pattern is composed of pitches of the voice, shown here by numbers, and ways in which we end stretches of utterance, shown here by the single bar mark, which squeezes the pitch, this one here, which allows the voice to trail off into silence, and this one here, which represents the voice rising. Now, these particular numbers I can now read because they are a clue to which significant pitch level is used. Now, listen. He has a very pleasant personality. When I keep it up at pitch 2, 1 is the lowest and 4 is the highest pitch, and let it trail off into silence, I have now said the only thing this person has to recommend him is a sort of speciousness of personality. Now, if I say it this way. He has a very pleasant personality, and allow my voice to rise slightly there. He has a very pleasant personality. You hear that? That means now we would expect, but I don't like the way he parts his hair, I don't like the way he talks to his wife at the bridge table. Now if I say he has a very pleasant personality, come all the way down to pitch 1 and go off into silence, I've said it, I've made a compliment, made a complimentary statement in our culture. In other words, same distribution patterns, same grammatical patterns, but different intonation patterns. Gives me 3 entirely different meanings, and yet there's only one little piece of structure different in each one of these cases. In other words, patterns. Patterns are the things that do the job for us. Now, this business of patterning, this extremely important business of patterning, and I've just given you some very, very rapidly, some examples. We've mentioned distributional, grammatical patterns, now intonation patterns. But I want you to realize this, that this very quick survey of patterning, which is what we're going to be doing on this series of programs, that language itself, this amazing system of patterning, which is only the possession of human beings, language itself is not the only kind of pattern system that goes on in communication. That is communication now, meaning how people really interact with each other. Obviously, language is the principal mode of communicating, of interacting. But there are other things that go on, other patterns that are patterned in of themselves and patterned with language. Paralanguage, tone of voice phenomena over and above language. And kinesics. Kinesics, the structured and patterned use of bodily motion in communication. Now what we have to realize is this. We can actually not talk at all. That is, language can never be used for any appreciable length without paralanguage and kinesics at the same time. In other words, if you listen to me now, as you have been, you've heard my voice go up and down. You've heard, for instance, that particular over loudness that I used just then for emphasis. That kind of thing is part of paralanguage, what we call over loudness, and it can be measured in degrees and seen to pattern. I can also go over soft, and that can be used for emphasis too. And notice, as I'm talking, notice how my knees went down and my finger came out. I can't possibly talk without both paralanguage and kinesics. For instance, take kinesics for just a second. If I want to be sure you're listening to me, I can say something like this. Do you understand me? Do you really understand me? And you will notice that my head goes down. I'm digging you, so to speak. My eyebrows wrinkle and my eyelids blink up and down. I can't possibly speak a sentence, certain kinds of sentences, without a kinesic marker. For instance, just a simple sentence like this one. Suppose I wanted to say to you something like this. John gave Bill money. Did you notice what I did with my head? John gave Bill money. Did you see my head go over there on money? I've got to give a signal with my body when I get to that particular word. I've got John gave Bill money. If it's not my head, it's going to be my thumb or some part of my body. John gave Bill money. Head can go on that side. But I have to use part of this other patterning along with language in order to really talk. Again, paralanguage, all kinds of things can happen here, and we know what they are. We know how to structure them. Let me give you an example we call the vocal characterizer of breaking of the voice. For instance, if I say, yeah, I suppose so. Now this nervous giggle obviously signals that I'm not quite secure in what I'm saying. If I use, for instance, that breaking in another context, and as I lay down my burden to those younger and stronger than I, there's a politician. That breaking is supposed to give you an idea of how emotionally he's involved in what he's saying. Now, when all of these things fit together, they are what we call congruent. In other words, when paralanguage and when language and when kinesics all pattern together in an expected way, then communication goes on with relatively little disturbance. In other words, if I should see you in the morning, I should say, how are you this morning? With a smile like that, and that kind of kinesics, that's congruent. But if I should say, how are you this morning? With that kind of paralanguage and that kind of kinesics, that's not congruent. Now, the whole business of checking congruence and incongruence has actually allowed us to see, since we can symbolize this business now, has actually allowed us to see what really goes on in communication. And this is being used now to help people understand what goes on in the psychotherapeutic interview. Linguists and kinesiologists are now helping psychiatrists really evaluate the psychotherapeutic interview.